of a trade war between the United States and China have escalated after China announced it would tax American imports at 25%, just like the U.S. has. These increased duties on around $50 billion worth of items includes imports like soybeans, automobiles, chemicals and aircraft, imports that would affect Trump's voters as well. Right now, it seems to be a case of who will blink first, because the U.S. list of tariffs on China kicks in after a consultation process. China's counter tariffs kick in when the U.S. tariffs do. So has a trade war between the two largest economies in the world begun? How will it impact global trade and India, of course? To speak on this, I'm joined now by Raj Bhala from the University of Kansas. He's also a Bloomberg Quint opinion writer, as well as Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador of India to the WTO. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for speaking with us this evening on Primetime Debate. I'm going to pose the first question to Mr. Bhala. Is it safe to say that the trade war has begun, or are both sides still testing each other's patience?
I think both sides are still testing. They have announced their retaliation that started firing.
All right, I'm going to hope to clear up that line a little more so I can hear you more clearly, Mr. Bhala. But let me take that question to Jayant Dasgupta. Where do you see this story going, Mr. Dasgupta? Because ever since, the announcement from Beijing on the counter tariffs, we've seen a couple of tweets from President Trump saying that we've already lost this war a long time ago. He seems very keen to take this further. Do you think it will escalate from here?
It is not a trade war which has started. It is, I think, the hostilities have been there for quite some time. This is a phase when muscle flexing is taking place, and the two sides are showing off their small arms. So without a shot having been fired, or a minor shot has been fired really under the Section 232, steel and aluminium tariffs and reciprocal tariffs by China. But war has not really started. And I think the Chinese have made it very clear that they would be wanting to have a negotiated settlement. They are willing to look at the American grievances, the demands that they make, and they can look at them, they can make appropriate reciprocal gestures. But having said that, I think the U.S. also needs to be very clear as to what it wants, because to impose tariffs on 1,300 tariff lines is a bit too much, considering the fact that in the whole tariff universe there are only about 10,000 tariff lines. So the U.S. has to narrow down its demand list, focus on what it really wants, and then the Chinese are willing to talk. They have, in fact, already taken the initiative to open up their market in the financial services sector in areas which the U.S. wanted. They have fast-forwarded their opening to May end. So they have shown the right gesture. But the Chinese can't be expected to make all the concessions and also lose face. So there has to be this, factor which needs to be taken care of by the U.S. And the public hearing, which is to take place in May, when the U.S. finalizes the items on its list as to which of them are going to be subjected to tariff, that is when the U.S. domestic industry, different sectors of the industry which are going to get affected by the Chinese reciprocal tariffs, they are going to come forward and they are going to have their say. So it is a question of give and take, I think, at the moment.
All right. Mr. Dasgupta, of course, you've been a former Indian ambassador to the WTO. What role do you think the WTO will play in a situation like this? And is it equipped to handle the level of aggression we have seen coming from the American side as well? Remember, a lot of these moves have been backed by saying this is in national security interest of the United States.
The WTO, I think, unfortunately for the time being, has been taken out of the picture because the things that the US is threatening to do, take action under Section 301, and the retaliation that the Chinese are, preparing to take retaliatory action, both of them are not WTO compatible. Because still you have taken a dispute, both sides have taken their matters to the WTO, but it will take upwards of a year, if at all, this matter progresses in the WTO. So before that, they are going to raise the tariffs if it comes to a war. So the WTO, unfortunately, is not in a position to influence matters at either end, at the end of the US or the Chinese at the moment.
I've got Raj Bhala back on the line, and I hope we can hear you more clearly this time. I want you to put this into perspective because on the one hand, you have Donald Trump, who has shown that he's pulling no punches. On the other hand, you have Xi, who has made himself leader for life, pretty much. And has this now slowly turned into a battle of egos? Where do you see it going from here?
Well, I hope not. I hope that this is not a battle of egos, a war that is based on ad hominem argumentation and personalities. At the core of the problem, we have to look at the core of the problem, and they are two separate cases. The Section 301 case is about allegations, long-standing allegations of Chinese intellectual property misappropriation, allegations that the business communities, including in India and around the world, have been quite familiar with and indeed been victimized by. And those allegations are clearly laid out in the USTR Section 301 report, which spans over 200 pages. The Section 232 case is conceptually different. It is not targeted specifically at China. Rather, it concerns impairment of American national security based on steel imports and aluminum imports from around the world. So the vital thing is not to focus on personalities. That will only exacerbate the problem. And let's be clear, neither of the leaders is particularly sympathetic. Both have their virtues and both have their vices. The point, as we lawyers and ambassadors should focus on, is what is the core substantive issues that are at play, and how can we, with cooler heads, resolve them?
All right, so let's look at the core issue there, and I want to welcome Ajay Dua into the conversation right now. He's, of course, a former DIPP secretary. The core issue is that there is a huge trade deficit. Donald Trump wants it cut down at least by $100 billion. Was tariffs the only way, and how can the United States and China move out of this confrontational space without either side losing face, Mr. Dua?
I think there are ways and means to get out of this situation. The President of the United States is probably falling prey to a degree of jingoism which is not called for in this particular matter. I say this somewhat emphatically because a trade war, tariff-related war, what we've started seeing for the last couple of days with Chinese reprisals coming, has never done anyone good. The level of economic activity will come down, probably in this case much more in the United States than in China, and the goals or the objectives which President Trump has for himself, that more jobs to be created, greater economic activity within the shores of the United States, that will probably take a hit by the route which is being followed. Having said that, let me say the question of intellectual property right which has been emphasized, or national security issues which are being talked about by the United States, those have been there for a while. There isn't anything new, or what was just now earlier being talked about the USTR's 200 pages of reports on all these kinds of things. That's all very well known, what is happening in China with respect to intellectual property, and how we might be TRIPS compliant in India, but probably the US administration and many Western countries expect us to do better than just being TRIPS plus on this issue of intellectual property. The provocation is what President Trump has said during his election campaign and what he is following up, that he doesn't believe in multilateralism and that all multilateral trade treaties have been adverse to the United States and that he is going to correct that. I think that is not the way forward. The rule-bound trade, or the rule-based trade as we call it, is a part of the WTO system in which the US does not seem to have the degree of confidence as of now compared to the predecessors of President Trump. And I hope that this is not carried forward for too long because, as I said, it is in nobody's interest to have this kind of a thing happen. And while the United States and China keep quarreling amongst themselves, there will be casualties all around the world, including in India, which will be probably an unintended result of these two giants fighting.
I want to come to the Indian perspective in a little more detail, but I also want to welcome Daniel Moss, Bloomberg View columnist, onto the discussion. Daniel, welcome. You have been writing, of course, before today on how there could still be a way out to avert the situation. Now, we have come to a tit-for-tat situation as of today. Do you think that there is a way to de-escalate from here?
Sure, there is a way, and the way remains in the use of the word proposal, which the Chinese side was very careful to use, the 2-month period before the US actually imposes anything on anybody, and the way President Trump has gone out of his way to praise President Xi, and in a tweet this morning saying, oh, by the way, I don't blame China, I blame all these idiots who came before me. There are still plenty of off-ramps here. I think if there's a surprise in terms of what China did overnight, it's that they unveiled their list. Folks weren't anticipating that coming so quickly, but they're still very careful to do only what the US is doing and nothing more and nothing less.
All right, so there may be some leeway over there, but I want to focus a bit on the India question. Let me come back to Mr. Dua on that point. On the face of it, of course, India is not a player in the current situation, though we will be appealing the tariffs on steel and aluminum that the United States put in place a couple of weeks ago. But if this does escalate, impact global trade, where does India fit in?
As you know, we are not a very major trade player in the world, be it particularly on the export sides, with our exports now having fallen below the 300 billion mark. We are a much bigger importer. We would, if countries start kind of imposing restrictions on our exports, the modest level of exports which we have, we would also, like the Chinese have done vis-a-vis the United States, start exploring both the tariff and the non-tariff barriers, which I think is not on. And if India also were to do what the Chinese are threatening to do, start imposing duties on aircrafts, higher duties on aircraft, both civilian and military, into India, and also India starts looking more seriously at the new oil and gas imports which we have started effecting from the United States. The United States becomes a much bigger loser than we do, because there are other options for other sources for oil and gas, and as always there is, particularly on the civilian side, options to buy aircrafts elsewhere rather than only in the United States. The second point which I would like to make in this, sorry, please go ahead.
No, sorry, I was just coming in with the point, and maybe...
No, what I was...
yeah, do continue, Mr. Dua, do continue.
Yeah. Now, what I was saying is that if there is, sorry, let me just, we are not really affected by the duties which the United States is going to be imposing on steel and aluminium, because in neither commodity or neither products we are a very big exporter, and particularly to the United States. So that's not going to be affecting us much. But the fact that the United States thinks that we are a challenge to it, merely because as of now there is a deficit against the United States, it should be probably, it's taking a somewhat myopic view, particularly in the context of the deals which are, or the transactions which are currently being initiated or are under process, right. Oil, gas, and the two kinds of aircraft.
I was just coming in with the point, and I'd like to
will run into hundreds of billions of dollars.
Sure, I was just coming in with a point, and I'd like to bring in Mr. Dasgupta here.
Please go ahead.
To the contrary, India seems to have closed that trade deficit gap over the last couple of years with the United States. Of course, we've shored up defense purchases, and that has helped. In the overall picture, is there an opportunity for India here to perhaps replace some of those goods and services vis-a-vis China, or does it turn into a direct hit perhaps on Indian exports?
I think you have to look at the composition of Indian exports to the U.S. and that comprises pharmaceuticals, finished gems and jewelry, some items of machinery, some agricultural products. Now, the items on which the U.S. is proposing to impose tariffs are high technology items, basically communication, satellites, robotics, and other things, aircraft parts, for instance. Now, in those products, India doesn't have a manufacturing base, and India is not a global player. So India would not be able to substitute for China in any way in those products. As far as the impact on India is concerned, if you look at the tariffs that India imposes on US products, if you look at the global average tariff that India imposes, it is approximately between 8 and 9%. On US products coming into India, the tariffs are less than 5%. And this is because India imports a lot of capital goods from the US at zero duty. India imports a lot of diamonds, for instance, at zero duty. Mineral oil, again, very low duty. Aircraft, 3% duty. So the overall impact on the US of tariffs imposed by India is very low. And we need those items for our own industries and our own economy. So if we raise those tariffs, we would be shooting ourselves in the foot. So we just can't afford to do it, and there is no reason for us to do it.
You know, I want to come back to the point I was making earlier, Mr. Bhala, on what is at the root of this move from the United States. And, you know, let's jog back to the first tweet that Donald Trump put out, where he said that, you know, it's easy when a country like the USA is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country it does business with. Trade wars are good and easy to win. It's important to start there because Donald Trump has spoken about India in the context of Harley Davidson's. There was not too much fact to that statement. Any country which has a trade surplus may be on that list, and does India run that risk as well, Mr. Bhala?
Well, it does. As the ambassador quite rightly pointed out, this is not really a tariff story as between India and the United States. Rather, the real vulnerability from a trade war that India faces is first a diminution in aggregate demand overseas. If aggregate demand falls in the United States and China and Europe, Indian exports to those countries, however big or small they are likely to fall, and the potential for export growth will diminish simply because of the decline in aggregate demand overseas. A second vulnerability that India faces is on the import side. If trade is diverted away from the U.S. market and indeed the Chinese market, thanks to higher tariffs on both sides, there's a risk that those goods that otherwise would have gone to the U.S. or China get put into the Indian market, possibly at dump prices, threatening Indian producers. Then there's also a risk that was quite rightly pointed out, I think, by Mr. Dua, that concerning the multilateral system and the rule of law. If indeed the Trump administration is serious about taking to the WTO the bona fide claims that America has on, say, IP, then the best thing the administration can do is wish for and work towards a strong dispute settlement system. And actually, the United States has been doing quite the contrary. It has been blocking the appointment of new appellate body members. And by September, we will be down at the appellate body to hardly 4 members. And that's a real crisis in dispute settlement. So these, and if the dispute settlement system collapses or atrophies, that's also bad for India, because India relies on that dispute settlement system for peaceful, rule of law-based settlement of disputes, and it's won some big cases, including on zeroing.
You know, I want to bring Daniel here for a broader picture. Of course, if this escalates, pretty much every large economy will be impacted, possibly India as well. Daniel, do you think it will come down to who has more leverage? And in this case, perhaps China, because it is such a major purchaser of U.S. treasuries?
It's important to separate the treasuries question from the rest of it. Yes, it's a form of leverage China has, but there is no comparable debt market anywhere in the world the size of the United States. Now, China has been taking steps to open its debt market. Its capital markets are still minnows relative to the United States, and foreign participation in its bond market, while growing, is still relatively small. Look, you've got ample opportunity here for some sort of negotiated deal to happen. And by the way, is it 25% tariff on everything, or a 25% estimate to get to the aggregate figure? In other words, do some products have very little tariff applied and others have more? Look, there's 2 months to go at least before this list is finalized. Anything can happen in a day in the Trump White House, let alone 2 months. That's 2 months for American multinationals, many of whom anchor the global supply chains, to climb all over this and get concessions and get things watered down.
I think that's something perhaps China is banking on as well. We'll have to end it here, but thank you so much to all of you, Ajay Dua, Jayant Dasgupta, Daniel Moss and Raj Bhala, for joining us this evening, talking about whether a trade war has begun and what can be done to avert it, of course, the Indian impact as well.